So this is going to get more specific to healthcare facilities, both acute care and ambulatory care. So it's OSHPOD projects and non-OSHPOD projects. I've got the outline on screen. I know many of you are probably still coming back from your lunch. So let me just kind of talk through what we're going to go over in the afternoon. We'll cover the 11B 805 section. So that's probably about 40 minutes. That's going to go through 7 subsections. We'll take a little 5-minute break. I think I'm going to use the break to take questions because we had actually quite a few questions. The medical room types, then we'll go over about 30 minutes of that. We're going to go over different room types. So that'll be the breakdown of an exam room, a treatment room, a blood draw room, patient bedroom, and so on. We'll take another break. We'll do a little game show. And then in the latter part of the day, again, I think it's the best part of the presentation, these special issues that are pretty much healthcare specific. And so you don't want to miss those. So I've stretched out my conversation enough. I hope everybody's back now after our lunch break. I'm going to go ahead and get into this first section. So this is the technical requirements from 11B 805. We've been referring all morning to the technical requirements that we're going to talk about in the afternoon. This is that time. So there's 7 subsections as shown on screen. This first one is general. There's not a lot to it. That's the section there. This is what we talked about in the scoping this morning, that more or less this says medical care facilities and long-term care facilities shall comply with this section. That includes all common use spaces and public use spaces. And that's it. So I don't want to belabor that. This does specifically reference then, as we talked about this morning, that lower part of the slide, the scoping for professional offices of healthcare providers, that reference with the blue arrow, that pointed to this section. So I'm going to move on to this point 2 section. So this is patient bedrooms. The specific accessibility requirements for patient bedrooms. There's not a lot to it. The scoping we saw earlier this morning, that's referring to mobility features like we talked about. Those of you that have done hospital work probably know these by heart. The subsections are hand washing fixtures, beds, and a turning space. Now the hand washing fixtures shall be accessible. Pretty much that's it. There are no exceptions. That's whether it is the 10% of rooms that are accessible or the 90% that are being designated as non-mobility. All of them have to have hand washing fixtures that are accessible, that meet the requirements of 11B 606. This point 2 section on beds, you need a 36-inch aisle along the full length of each side of the bed, and then you have to have a turning space. I want to point out that OSHPOD has a 1224 section of code that has what's kind of a parallel requirement. So again, I assume most all of you that do hospital work, you're intimately familiar with the 1224 code section. That's the part of the code that speaks specifically to hospitals and hospital requirements as well as skilled nursing. So the point 14 section here says you have to have 3 feet between the sides and foot of the bed and any wall or other fixed obstruction. So as you can see, both of these requirements exist in different parts of the code. One of them is an accessibility requirement, and one of them is a medical requirement, but both more or less say the same thing. You need 3 feet all around. So with that in mind, then I've got a graphic that kind of shows this graphically. You need the knee and toe space at the hand washing fixture. You need an aisle on both sides of your bed, and you need a turning circle. That's the basic guts of it. Now there's a dozen other things you need to do. You have to provide door clearances, the toilet room has to meet toilet room requirements and so on. But this is the healthcare specific stuff. Now I want to show a picture of a room. So this one, it happens to be Sutter Roseville, which is near and dear to my heart. I'm out there all the time because I live out in this area. So this is showing the 36-inch aisle, not a big deal, not mysterious. A point that I want to make though is the home base thing. So we all understand real people come in and use the room. The patient and their family come in and then they check out, and then a day later somebody else comes in. The furniture gets moved around. I'm okay with that. Oshpod is okay with that. Nobody cares. From time to time, that equipment, that furniture will be in that clearance. What I ask of all of our Sutter projects is our architects need to demonstrate that we have a home base for all the furniture and all the equipment, so that if I had to, I could hit the reset button, put everything away where it belongs, and I can demonstrate that we have a 36-inch aisle on both sides of the bed and all the clearances are there. If that is true, then I sleep well at night and I don't worry that some of the furniture is going to move around. So let me stop at this point. Bill Whipple, do we have any questions regarding this so far?
Actually, good one. Our sleep center is required to follow the same side of bed clearances, at least the ADA room.
So when you say sleep center, do you think that's the staff sleep room, or are they talking about a sleep study?
Sleep study rooms. And
Oh,
sometimes
so
those can be in the outpatient setting. So this is actually a tricky one. So
yeah, so there's a
these are
lot going on
overnight
there.
stays, technically sleeping rooms. Yeah.
Yeah, so so we've had that come up a couple of times. Again, we've gone to our brain trust of access specialists to talk about it. A couple of takeaway points on that. If you're dealing with a sleep study room, so most likely that's in an outpatient setting, even though it's overnight, it's typically not done in a hospital. Whether it is or it isn't, it's not designated as a patient bedroom. In code, a patient bedroom is a real specific thing. That goes on the hospital license. It's designated as a patient bedroom. There's X number of beds. It has to have a window. It has to have certain requirements, certain square footage. I don't think you're talking about one of those when you're doing a sleep study. So technically, this clearance requirement does not apply. The things that I would revert to then is say, well, you still have to be able to get on and off the bed. I would probably go to the 30 by 48-inch clear floor space to get in and out of the bed. But it really is a kind of a squirrely, unusual, different scenario that code may not speak directly to. Does it belong more in a residential application of code? Where exactly does it fit? You'd have to talk over with the building official where does it fit in terms of code compliance. You could apply the patient bedroom requirements, but I think it's a misapplication. And yet that, in some cases that might make perfect sense, truly. You might scope it at 10%, make sure 10% of them are accessible for mobility features, have the 36-inch aisle on both sides of the bed. That would probably work for people, but again, you'd want to talk that over with a building official. Other questions?
Actually, related to that one, Bill, for sleep rooms, can you address the same question? So in a hospital, you have a sleep room. It is an ADA sleep room. Are you required to have clearances on both sides?
Well, I think I've already answered the bulk of that. There's a question whether you're going to classify it. It's technically not a patient bedroom, not in the context of a licensed hospital. Now, I suppose if you have a licensed hospital with a licensed bedroom, then yeah, it's a bedroom. It's a patient bedroom. These absolutely apply. If it's not that, then you're going to have to work with the building official to figure out where do we put this in the code? What code sections are you going to hold us accountable to? That's I think the same thing. What
Here's a
else?
question about the term home base, and if we use that term in terms of where something gets parked. Question is the home base a code requirement or is it a best practice? For example,
Okay.
do we not provide a home base for all equipment? Um, so I think this goes to like what's
Yeah,
really allowed in that
yeah,
3-foot
yeah,
clearance.
yeah, definitely. So let me answer it a couple of ways. So I remember sitting in and hearing former state architect Chet Whittam describe DSA jurisdiction in writing code. And he said, think of it this way. If you take a building and you hold it upside down and you shake it, everything that falls out, that's not OSHPD or DSA's jurisdiction. The furniture is not under their jurisdiction. Nonetheless, these code sections say what they do, and we're in a weird wrinkle in the code where the code requires a 36-inch aisle alongside of the bed, and the bed itself is on wheels. It's a piece of furniture. So to get around to answering the question, code does not require the home base. That is a term I've made up so that we can process projects in a thoughtful way at Sutter. We need to have, in my opinion, a home base so I know that everything has a place. And let me explain why that is. When we do a real accessibility survey, real meaning um, we're trying to determine, will this actually work for somebody who's a wheelchair user? If you put furniture in that aisle, it won't work for somebody who's trying to use one of those lifts. The very purpose of showing those videos at the beginning of our day together is to make that point. That takes a lot of space. When somebody needs to do that, if you've got permanent furniture, not necessarily anchored to the floor, but furniture that lives in that room that's not going to be taken out at the end of each day, if all that furniture is gumming up your access aisle, I think number one, OSHPD's probably not going to approve it, but if they do, it doesn't actually satisfy the needs of somebody who's disabled. You'll have a true legal problem on your hands. But no, code does not require home base. I've made that concept up myself. Next question.
Is the 4 feet at the bottom of the bed double occupancy rooms an accessibility requirement also? Does it require to have a 60-inch circle at each bed? So these are double occupancy patient bedrooms is I think where this is going to.
Yeah, so at the foot of the bed, OSHPD's requirements say 48 inches at the foot of the bed, between the foot of the bed and any fixed object. That's not an accessibility thing. From an accessibility standpoint, you need an accessible route, which is 36 inches. The turning circle, it may be wise to have it between the beds if you've got double occupancy, but code doesn't specify it has to be here or it has to be there. That's professional, good practice, good judgment. Okay, maybe one last question and then we got to move on. What else have we got?
I think that's it for right now.
All right.
We looked at this.
So, blah, 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 home base, medical equipment. It's understood medical equipment will be placed from time to time in that access aisle. Nobody cares. That's fine. That's not an accessibility problem. We did questions, moving on to waiting rooms. So this is the point 3 section, waiting rooms. So this code section requires 5% of the seating in a waiting room to be set aside for wheelchair use, and 10% if you're dealing with a unit that specializes in treating conditions that affect mobility. Probably easier to show this in a graphic. So what you would actually do, and by the way, this applies both in hospitals and in medical offices. It's a medical care requirement. And I think I would bet on it in a lot of, no offense to local building officials, just they may not be dialed in on this, that this is one of the code requirements they should hold people accountable to. You'd have to do the math on how many chairs do we have in our furniture layout. And in this example, we have 23, 5% of 23 would be 1.15 or 2 whole spaces. You need to demonstrate, like I've got on the orange arrows, a spot for 2 separate wheelchair users. Now that is not like you have to have masking tape on the floor that designates here's where a wheelchair user would go. And yes, we're into a weird code wrinkle where we're now required to show a furniture layout for building code compliance purposes. It's a little bit odd, but that's the way it is. Usually, this is not a problem. And when it is, you just take out some furniture. I say that as if it's easy. I know in reality, I'm sure that's a problem. I'm going to move on. Exam, diagnostic, and treatment rooms. So this is the one that we got a lot of questions. There's a lot to this. So that's the code section there on screen. The gist of it is circled there that beds, exam tables, procedure tables, gurneys, and lounge chairs. A 36-inch minimum wide clear space shall be provided along the full length of each side of the beds, exam tables, procedure tables, gurneys, and lounge chairs. Then there's an exception for general exam rooms in non-emergency settings for one side only. So I want to kind of slow down and break this down. First, as we said in the scoping, I think there was a question this morning. It is 100% of exam rooms and treatment rooms and diagnostic rooms, all of them. Second, I want to point out OSHPOD's CAN interprets that this clearance includes a 36-inch aisle at the foot of the bed. So this is different than what we talked about 5 minutes ago, where OSHPOD has a patient bedroom requirement for a 48-inch clearance at the foot of the bed. This is not that. This is in an exam room or a procedure room, a treatment room, or whatever, that OSHPOD has the code language that says a 36-inch aisle on both sides, but they interpret it to include the foot of the bed. Frankly, that may be stretching what the code actually says, but it doesn't really matter because in practical terms, you have to have an aisle to get back and forth from one side to the other anyway. So there's still more ground to cover here. I'm going to show through a series of photographs kind of what that looks like on the right side of an X-ray table and on the left side of an X-ray table, a clear aisle. At an MRI room, the left side, we have an aisle, the right side, we have an aisle. In an infusion room, so this is where it starts getting a little squirrely. We could do the aisle on both sides like is shown on the slide, but in reality, if you get on and off the infusion chair from the front, then there's no real practical purpose to putting the clearance on the side. Now, what we at Sutter have done, we've moving with the times. Our new generation of infusion chairs don't look like this at all. It's a new generation of infusion chair that the arm folds up and you do get on from the side, the left side or the right side. So then this requirement actually makes sense all over again. So going back to the code language, I want to break down the exception. There's two conditions to qualify for the exception. Number one, is it a general exam room? And number two, is it in a non-emergency setting? So I'm going to explain each of those separate, but before I do, the good news here, the two of those things almost never coincide. If you have something that actually is a general exam room, it's almost never in a non-emergency setting. I'm sorry, it's never in an emergency setting. So you don't hardly ever have the two of those things conflicting. So let me break this down a little further. The general exam room language, general means not specialized. The way I like to describe it, it's the walks like a duck argument. If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, swims like a duck, it's probably a duck. Same thing for the general exam room. We've all been in exam rooms all our life. We've gone to the doctor in the doctor's office. If you go into a room or you're looking at a floor plan of a room that looks just like the exam rooms you've seen all your life for your doctor, probably that is a general exam room. It's not specialized. Now, there is a definition in the code, and I got to say, in OSHPD's CAN 2-11B, their interpretive document, they make this very point. This examination room definition is what they're referring to. I'm not going to go through the language, and frankly, I'm not sure that it gets me anywhere when I do, but the point is it's not a specialized room. So on this slide, I'm showing one side access is required only for general exam rooms, which might be an exam room or an exam plus or a triage room, maybe. The exam plus, I think that's actually a Kaiser terminology. We've kind of lifted and borrowed it. It's basically a larger exam room. So those are the room names that might have the one side exemption. The list of rooms, and this is not an exhaustive all-inclusive list, it's a whole lot of specialized versions of exam rooms. Those are not given this exception because they're not general exam rooms. Now, moving on to the non-emergency setting piece of this. So the way I describe it, while code does not define it, the way OSHPD intends it, and I've talked to the people that wrote the code section at length, I'm pretty certain I know what they mean. A non-emergency setting would be not for life-saving procedures. So while you can do life-saving procedures, I suppose, anywhere, if the room is designed for life-saving procedures, it's probably an emergency setting. If your room is a general exam room like your doctor's office, yeah, that's not an emergency setting. So the good news again, when you qualify as a general exam room, it's almost a slam dunk. It will not be classified as being an emergency setting. And while we're dealing with a double negative, what that means is you're okay to have one side access only. So a lot of talk. Let me go to what you understand better, a floor plan. So in an exam room, now you may very well choose to put your exam table along one side or along a wall in your room. You need to have an access aisle along one full length and the foot of the exam table. That's what the code language is saying there. So let me pause here. Mr. Whipple, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, so there's a question is, do we need to provide 3 feet clear all around a CT, MRI, or linear accelerator?
No, not as an accessibility thing, no. So you're dipping into, what the question there is dipping into, OSHPD has a 1224 requirement that says you have to have a 3-foot aisle all around the equipment. That's not an accessibility requirement. That's on OSHPD. When I say OSHPD, it's shorthanding. That's under OSHPD's jurisdiction to write the code requirements for that sort of thing. But it's not an accessibility thing. So no, from an accessibility standpoint, you don't need to have a 36-inch aisle all the way around a CT. What else? Other questions?
Yeah. So, hold on a second. So this is going back to the waiting room. So it took a little while for the question to come in. Can the 36-inch by 48-inch clear space in the waiting area overlap with the 36-inch path of travel aisle between chairs?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Yeah, and again, we're into, for me, this is just strange, weird stuff. It's not a black and white world. It's not pure. We're holding a furniture layout to building code requirements. That just strikes me as odd, and yet that's the world we're in. So when you do that, if there's an accessible route that takes you from this doorway over to that doorway, and you snake your way through the waiting room to get there, this required 30 by 48-inch clear space which is intended to place a wheelchair user. If a building code official doesn't tell you, no, that's not allowed, I'd be shocked. You can't do that to people. You don't want to place a wheelchair user in the middle of the room where they're literally in the aisle. That's not right. Now, they could probably point to sections of code that say that, the accessible route requirement, but this is loosey-goosey, strange stuff. That's the way I'd answer that one. Other question?
Okay, so just to clarify, the answer is no. The wheelchair clear space should be not overlapping the aisle.
As my wife will tell you, sometimes I give a longer answer than necessary. So yes, the answer is no.
Okay. Let's see here. Long-term care, 5% wheelchair space is required for dining room. Ooh, good question.
Say again, 5%?
So if you're in a skilled nursing facility or any type of long-term care facility, and that facility has a dining room, are you required to provide wheelchair spaces at 5%?
No. So let me break this apart. There's a couple of different pieces to that. Long-term care, I don't know that that factors into our code analysis at all. Probably not. I'm not seeing any implication. The issues at stake here, it's a dining room or a waiting room. Dining room, you apply the dining room requirements per 11B 226, I think it is, scoping section for dining and work surfaces. That's your 5% requirement. That's a different thing. That's a requirement to have a spot at a table for somebody to dine, but it's not a waiting room. You don't apply waiting room, which happens to be a 5% requirement. They happen to be the same, but for two completely different purposes. So the answer is no. Okay. No, with an explanation. You don't have to provide 5% wheelchair sitting spaces. It's not a waiting room.
Excellent. I think that's.
Let me freelance a little bit further on that. I know we've had these conversations with our access specialist group. There's a little bit of annoyance that sometimes these issues we get into take us to a place where there's not a definition in the code for a waiting room, and there's not. So What it really means, well, I think we all know, it's you've come for a medical appointment. You're waiting for your time slot and for the doctor to be available, and then they take you in the back. When you have a room for that, that's a waiting room. Okay, you said that's all the questions? I'm gonna move on. So another piece of this, the last piece of this particular point 4 section is equipment. A clear space complying with 305.2 shall be provided as required for specific equipment. Oh, and then there is actually, I forgot about that, a last requirement. There's a turning space requirement, very much like a patient bedroom. But it's the other one that I want to go to, the equipment requirement. So as we read in the earlier code section, it's all about, and then there's kind of a laundry list, gurneys, exam tables, stretchers, and anything that looks like that, lounge chairs. Not all medical equipment is one of those things. So for example, in mammography, this is a piece of medical equipment. It's not anything like an exam table. It's not a lounge chair. It's something else entirely. So what the code is saying, I'm going to flip back to that previous code section. Equipment, you have to have a clear space complying with this 305.2, which is that rectangle, for that specific equipment. So what that really means, mammography equipment, you approach it from the front. That's where you have to have your 30 by 48 inch clear floor space so that a patient in a wheelchair can roll up to it and use the mammography equipment. Questions? Nothing typed in yet?
No.
All right, we'll move on. The point 5 section here is patient change areas. That's the whole code section there. It's one sentence. Areas where patients change or are prepared for procedure shall comply with 11B 222. Now I want to unpack this a little bit. We have people that, their job is to be code compliance people, make sure we've done all the right stuff from an accessibility standpoint. And so we see these words on the screen and we want to know, what do they mean? A patient change area, what is that? And what is it when a patient changes? So we've had, frankly, I've sat down, most of you probably know Glenn Gall at Oshpod, who's now recently retired, by the way. We've sat down and had long sessions talking about this, just to be clear. So, the devil's advocate question has come up. So if a patient goes into an exam room and they take off their shoe, are they changing? So at which point Glenn Gall rolls his eyes at me. He's like, really? You really are asking this? So obviously, if it's not obvious, this is the intent that Oshpod is getting at here. When we have procedures in all of our medical facilities where in order to do the procedure, you need to do what amounts to a full change of clothing. You're going to change into a gown for the procedure. You can't just put a little curtain around a corner of the room and say, hey, that's where our people are going to change. And Oshpod has seen people that try to get away with that. So they wrote it into the code requirements because the problem for people that are disabled, it's not that easy for them. They need to have a bench. So what Oshpod is saying, in areas where somebody is going to change for a procedure, you have to provide for them a patient changing area. Now it cross-references this 222 section, which is scoping. That tells you that you have to have 5% of your dressing rooms meet the access requirements. So if you've got 6 dressing rooms side by side, you'll only need to make one of them an accessible dressing room. The dressing room requirements, you've probably all seen this before. You need the coat hooks and shelves at a maximum of 48-inch height, mirrors meeting the dressing room requirements, the bench. So the bench must have a space beside the bench. So the magic of this is When somebody is transferring from their wheelchair to a bench, some people feel comfortable doing that along the long axis of the bench, kind of pulling alongside and transferring laterally. Other people find it more convenient for them to pull alongside of the short axis of the bench and transfer what is at a 90-degree angle from the other orientation. So you have to design the dressing room to have a space on the side. You can't have a bench that goes wall to wall. So hopefully I'm making sense in the way I'm describing that. Mr. Whipple, do we have any questions?
Well, I think now might be a decent time to address the lingering protruding object, and more specifically, the circulation path question. And that, does a circulation path include the definition of a room, or is it within a room?
You know what? I'm gonna put that off. There's a better place that I can address this in about, I don't know, 10 to 15 minutes from now.
Okay,
If we can put that one off.
all right.
Anything else?
I think the upper cabinet question also is coming up.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna move on. So the 0.6 section here, 805.6 hand washing fixtures. So I gotta tell you folks, some of you have seen this presentation before. We drop down and do 30 minutes on this hand washing fixture thing. I'm not gonna do that to you today. We're gonna go a little bit lighter than that. So we gotta start with defining. So here's the code section. All hand washing fixtures, lavatories and sinks shall comply with section 11B 606, which is effectively saying they shall be accessible. There's an exception for scrub sinks. So going back to OSHPD's interpretive document, they make this abundantly clear. All means all. All hand washing fixtures, all lavatories, all sinks. You're not going to get an exception for hardly anything. Now, I want to define a couple of things. A lavatory, by definition in the plumbing code, is for washing your hands and face, typically found in a bathroom. Separate from that is a sink for washing coffee mugs, dishes, endoscopes, and so on. So in our medical facilities, this would be both your break room sink as well as your sink that you might provide in a soiled utility room for cleaning stuff up, cleaning things out. It's not for washing your face. It's a different thing. The reason this is important, there are two different accessibility requirements for those two different things. And again, that's a California specific thing. I'm sure the people in the other 49 states shake their head and roll their eyes. Somehow our state decided to have two different knee and toe space requirements, and that makes our code compliance a lot more complicated. So this third thing is a hand washing fixture. That's specifically in the 1224 sections of code. It's designed for medical staff to wash their hands. Now, every now and then we get into a debate over these things. It is conceivable that, and people do all the time, the patients and the patients' families may actually use it, but it's designed for medical staff. The purpose of it is truly a medical thing. In any case, OSHPD holds the hand washing fixture to a lavatory standard. And I'll go over that in a minute, but I want to pause here and give you a little commentary and background. Back when I was at OSHPD for years and years and years, these were understood to be lavatories. I had just started doing seminars, maybe 2013, 2014-ish, and I had my slides that said these are lavatories. Just then, OSHPD changed course and decided to reclassify them as sinks. So I had to change all my slides and all my presentations. Well, now OSHPD has come back again, which I truly believe is the right thing. A hand washing fixture is for washing your hands, maybe not your face, but it is most like a lavatory. So while OSHPD's documents online, their CAN 2-11B, which is technically under the 2013 code, it says they're sinks, but their actual plan check staff have received an internal memo saying from now on, which was over a year ago, classify them in your plan reviews to be lavatories. So that may generate questions, we'll see. We've got some exempt fixtures, which are clinics, scrub sinks, mop sinks. So I've got more that I'm going to cover on this, but let me pause here.
Well,
Any
Bill, let's
questions?
go back one slide and let's
All
talk
right.
about those exempt sinks. How about in the kitchen and food service area? Are the
So,
sinks there exempt?
yeah, so this type of a kitchen sink is exempt, and the reason being, it's designed for a deep cleaning of pots. There's no way that you could do that and make it accessible. You won't have the knee space. You'll never be able to get the knee space.
And then as a follow-up, using these examples, let's say the scrub sink or that within the food service area, are they considered a workstation?
I wouldn't, it's subject to interpretation. If you're going to stand there and sink a bedpan for 20 minutes, I'd say, okay, yeah, that's a station that you're working at. But, and this is one of those things, there's not a definition in the code for what a work surface is. The definition in the code for workstation, I don't think it could be stretched to include these things. So what else?
I think that answers it.
Okay. So I'm going to go now to the technical parts of this. So I don't know if you guys are seeing every now and then for unknown reasons, this thing comes and goes. I apologize. I don't know how to make that stop. So the technical knee and toe space thing, I want to take you through kind of quickly, but I want to tell you the building code, California building code explanation of this is very confusing. So I'm not going to drag you through all the text. I'm going to just give you the answers. So in dealing with toe space, you start measuring from the front edge of the fixture and you measure back towards the wall. For lavatories, you need 17 to 19 inches of depth for your toe space. And at dining and work surfaces and sinks, you need 19 to 25 inches. That's the toe space requirement. Separately, there's a knee space requirement. The knee space is the area shown in blue that mostly is about the height, but also that depth. And this is where it's kind of wild. To measure it, you're measuring a point in space. You get down on one knee with a tape measure and you're measuring back 8 inches from the leading edge to see if you're 27 inches off the floor or not, and if you've run into the fixture body or not. Most accessibility people have a jig made out of cardboard or something, so they can just hold it up there and see if it complies or not. At the bottom of the slide, I've got the kind of Reader's Digest version of the requirements. So at lavatories, it's a 29-inch height. At the leading edge, that then reduces to a 27-inch height, 8 inches back. At sinks, it's a different requirement. You don't have that 29-inch height requirement, and similar for dining and work surfaces. So this isn't a seminar to go over all of that kind of detail. This is not really healthcare specific, except for the fact that you need to understand the hand washing fixture fits into the lavatory version of this. So, Mr. Whipple, do we have any questions regarding that?
We do. Pretty good question. So sometimes in the clinical setting, especially in hospitals, staff will make the preference of using a scrub sink, for example, to comply with the hand washing fixture requirement. Maybe that scrub sink, say for example, in a pharmacy, is more suitable to the method and manner of cleaning one's hands. So, in the instance that they use a scrub sink for that application, would it still need to be accessible?
That's a good question, and this one actually came up earlier. Ultimately, Oshpod's going to answer that, not me. Now, the way I would answer it is to say, if the code says in this kind of thing, you need a hand washing fixture, they're going to say, well, you need to provide that, and you need to provide an accessible one. You don't get out of the requirement because you chose a bigger model number that is a scrub sink that is physically so large you can't possibly get knee and toe space under it. You don't get to escape those code requirements for accessibility. That's the way I'd answer it. But Mr. Whipple, didn't we
Yes.
actually have Oshpod give us a
Uh,
pass on that on pharmacy projects?
well, I think we can tell you from experience in the 36 pharmacies that were upgraded as part of Sutter Health's efforts. Recently, we did come up with a scrub sink that was accessible, and that was what we're
Yay.
required to use.
Okay. It's nice when my interpretation aligns with what actually happened. So I like that. Any other questions?
We have, does dialysis equipment washing sink need to meet ADA? And it needs a 17-inch deep sink. Is this a workstation? Another great question.
So
Dialysis washing.
dialysis, well, that's a good question. The dialysis sink, that's going to be strictly for staff use, right? And what is it for?
Yeah, so I think the challenge here, let's use a patient room. Oftentimes, like in a med-surg patient room, they may use the hand washing fixture inside the med-surg room to uh, to work with the dialysis equipment. And then there's other instances where dialysis equipment may be in a completely remote location. Uh, so let's start with the patient room example. I think that's happened a couple of times. So you got a hand wash requirement, but then you need to use that same sink for dialysis equipment.
So I'm not entirely sure if I get the nuance. The room will have been previously built. It's licensed as a patient bedroom. It's going to be held to the requirements for a patient bedroom, which includes an accessible hand washing fixture.
Yeah.
If they
So
roll in some equipment, I'm sorry, go ahead.
so which would take precedent, the requirements of the equipment used in the room or the ADA hand washing requirement?
Well, I'm going to answer it a different way.
Okay.
So, so I don't know if they're saying the room will be licensed for dialysis use only. If it's to be used today for a patient bedroom, a regular med surg room, and then tomorrow a dialysis patient is assigned to that room, and you bring in for that couple of days dialysis equipment, as I said earlier, nobody cares that for a day or two you've got equipment in there for the staff to use that sits in the aisle or otherwise mucks up the arrangement. Are you talking about, though, a room that is all the time, always a dialysis room? I'm not clear on that.
Yes. Yeah, the question specifically reads, does dialysis equipment washing sink needs to meet ADA? It needs a 17-inch deep sink. Is this a workstation?
Okay. So I'm only going to be able to go so far on this. So I would answer it in the context of like a dialysis clinic. That's where we see this in a medical environment probably most frequently. In that kind of setting, it's a healthcare provider. The 11B 805 code sections do apply. I don't think code, unless it's an OSHPD 3 clinic, I don't think code requires that you have a hand washing fixture. You may provide one. If you do, it should be accessible. Um, I'm not sure why, under any circumstances I can think of, that you would be allowed to have a non-accessible version of that. That's the way I'd read it. So I want to keep us up. I don't want to get into too many what ifs. Um, I'll point back to the OSHPD sentence that says all hand washing fixtures, sinks, and lavatories shall meet 11B 606, which is the accessibility requirements for knee and toe space. So there's not likely that you're going to find some way to escape the word all. So I want to go through this. This point 7 section is the final section of 805, and then we'll take a break. And during the break, we'll take questions. So this last section, I alluded to this earlier, the code giveth and the code taketh away. This is where that happens. We had that employee workstation exemption that we talked about earlier. So this code section deals with, so I've got the text on screen there. I'm breaking it down by color coding. The red is the subject of the code section. It is built-in cabinets, counters, and work surfaces. The green are examples, and the purple is the specific requirements. The exceptions are kind of self-explanatory. So let's go through these one at a time. The subject of the code section is strictly built-in cabinets, counters, and work surfaces. They shall be accessible. The examples that I've got on screen, and we talked a little bit earlier about the cabinets, this is where that's going to come in, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail in just a moment. But that's the subject of this code section. The green are examples. That's all it is. It's kind of a laundry list. It's patient wardrobes. And then the rest of those are all staff things. It's the nurse station, administrative center, reception desk, medicine preparation area, laboratory workstation, equipment console, clean and soil utility cabinets, and storage areas. So while the code giveth earlier that employee workstations can receive some exemptions, these specific things, the built-in cabinets, counters, and work surfaces, nonetheless must be made accessible. And then the specific requirements of what that is the purple section here, the 11B 225 and 902, which is the storage and dining and work surface requirements. So that 225 is storage. Now there's a code section you can cross-reference and look up the 11B 225. I'll save us the time and energy to do that and cut to the chase. Storage is defined as requiring at least one of each type shall be accessible, which ultimately means within reach range. That's the one that you've got to worry about. So as we go back to this photo that shows upper and lower cabinets, what this code section requires is at least one of each type shall be accessible. So if you design a room that has upper cabinets only, then we've got to ask, that is a type of storage. Where is your accessible version of that if you don't have any lower cabinets? That's our problem, and that specifically applies, as that laundry list denoted, in staff areas that's in a healthcare facility. This is completely different than what you would do at a school or a restaurant or anywhere else. This only applies in healthcare facilities. Department of Justice has an advisory that gives a listing of types of storage. The one that we're talking about here is cabinets. So that's really the takeaway of this, is that is something we have to pay attention to. The 902 is the requirements for a work surface. So dining and work surface requirement. Now, this is where it gets a little interpretive, so I want to explain. In the morning session, we talked about scoping. That's where they would tell you how many, how much, blah, blah, blah. This doesn't tell you that. This just says 11B902. It doesn't point us back to 226. My slide does, but that code section doesn't. So in my humble opinion, the appropriate thing to do is to go to 11B226. Now, the weird thing about it, I don't have the text on screen because I want to try to keep this simple. What the code language says is something to the effect of, in all but employee areas, you shall provide 5% scoping, which leaves an open-ended question. Then what are we supposed to do for scoping in an employee area in this context and this code section? So I've had this conversation with Oshpod. I think everybody agrees the reasonable thing to do is to apply the 5% scoping. So the upshot of it all, if you've got a nurse station, you may have 3 or 4 workstations or work surfaces for individual people to sit. I would apply the 5% and say code requires me to make 5% or at least one of those meet the work surface requirement, which is the surface height and the knee and toe space. That's the only way I can really make sense of this. And where this takes us is then you need to pay attention. If you get into these discussions with Oshpod, you have to pay attention. These countertops, they may be classified as a work surface or they may not. If it is, you have to make 5% of them meet the access requirements, which requires your knee space. But the code doesn't define a work surface. So that's where we've again had this discussion with our brain trust. And I don't know that there's an absolute number or definition, but the way I would describe it, if you've got somebody that's doing a task that takes, more than 30 seconds or more than a minute, then it starts to feel more and more like a work surface. But if you've got somebody who more or less is working somewhere else, they walk over to this thing, they operate a gizmo on top of the counter for 15 seconds and they walk away, I'm not going to call it a work surface. And yet I can't point to anything definitive that defines it. So that's the deal on that. That I think takes us to questions. We have questions, Mr. Whipple.
Yeah, let's take the cabinet question that seems to come up oftentimes. So at least, Bill, you'd expressed in that slide, at least one of each type shall be accessible.
Yeah.
So the question that came up initially was if there was medications or linens that were being used and stored in an upper cabinet, is that acceptable? And even though would they need to meet the DA reach height requirements?
Yeah, so again, we're in this strange world where there's building code requirements and it starts to try to govern how we operate, but it can't. It can't possibly govern what we do 6 years from now. So what we can do from a building code project approval standpoint is require that if you're going to have an upper thing that's above the 48-inch height, you have to have a lower one. Now, 6 years from now, if somebody puts the jar of tongue depressors up on the high shelf, the building code official isn't part of this discussion. They're not going to know about it. They're not going to regulate it. We simply need to know that if we do have somebody who is a wheelchair user who's on our staff, we'll be able to take the jar of tongue depressors and put it down on a lower shelf, just as easy as on the upper shelf. As long as I know that's true, then we're good to go.
And so, and I know this is true with recent walks that we've done post-occupancy bill together.
Yeah,
If we go into a particular room and say it's one of, say it's the medication room or the clean utility for a department, and this could be even in the outpatient setting, if there is something stored in an upper cabinet, there just has to be the way to, at some future date, store that same thing in the lower cabinet. But I've seen instances where there might be something in an upper cabinet today, but it's not stored in a lower cabinet today. We just
yeah,
have a path forward when they hire somebody that may have the need to have a lower height.
yes, yes. So we have had that happen. We've had that discussion. I concur completely. I will add, this is a sore spot, I think, for a lot of people, or this, maybe to put it differently, this changes the way we've done it in the past. I'm sure there's 1,000 examples out there where there's rooms in a hospital that are for the staff use where they have upper cabinets only. That would not be compliant by today's code. Not that you have to retroactively change it, but this is a change in the way we've done it for years. So other questions? Are we going to move on?
Well, I think just to fully flush this out too, is we oftentimes find in post-occupancy where stuff is stored in an upper cabinet, we find bench or stools where individuals are using stools in which to reach and gain access to those upper cabinet items. So at Sutter Health, we more recently have gone to fewer upper cabinets and much more full height cabinets, and not putting them at a height that's requiring a stool or additional items.
Yeah, and I'll add one last thing to that. So what we're talking about, our world is the California Building Code and getting permits for construction and building stuff. That's governed under the ADA law by the ADA standards and the California Building Code standards. There's a whole separate topic that we're opening up here. Title I of the ADA is about the obligations of the employer. So when you have somebody actually on staff with a disability, then you have an obligation to make reasonable accommodations. And that's, you'd sit them down with HR and work out, well, how are we going to have them work here in this building? But that's on a one-on-one personal, one size does not fit all kind of basis. My world is the building code, so I'm going to sidestep the rest of that. So I want to keep us on track. I think where we are is we'll take a 5-minute break. So again, to keep us on track, I wanted to take any remaining questions during this 5 minutes. I won't cover any new material, but I'll be happy to answer questions if we have any.
Okay. So
So,
there's a question. Does a mobile treatment cart with supplies qualify as a lower cabinet? Replacement if you have only overheads in the exam room. So very
yeah,
similar questions I'm getting.
yeah, I almost got the impression you planted that one. Because the reason I say that for all the rest of you, we've had this issue come up. And when it comes up, when you're all done with construction and we're done and we're like ready to move in and somebody says, oh, no, you're not code compliant. You've only got upper cabinets and you don't really have the ability in practical terms to add in a base cabinet all of a sudden. What we have done on a one-off basis is said, well, we're going to use a rolling cart. And if we have somebody who actually is disabled and on our staff, that is what we will use. But I mean, you folks can see the problem here. That's not part of the building. We'd be subject to criticism on that count. Now, I think fortunately in our case, I don't believe Oshpod was raising the issue. That was our own team raising the issue. So we handled it with a rolling cart. Now, I didn't want to have to say that because I don't want somebody saying, Bill Zelmer said you could just do this with a rolling cart. I'll get talked to by the supervisors at Oshpod. So what else have we got?
A lot of questions on these cabinets. Virtually all nurse stations have an upper shelf at corridor side for visual screening. Does there need to be a 36-inch high section of the upper shelf to serve as a sales or service counter, even though no transactions typically take place there? So this is, I think,
Yeah.
related to the.
I'm going to see if I can go a few slides back. The visual is
Yeah.
always helpful. There it is. So there's 3 staff on one side of this nurse station counter and 1 standing up on the other side. I believe the question is, okay, the one at the standing side, if you view that as I'm sorry, what was the term? A sales and service counter, then shouldn't that be down at a 34-inch height? And the answer is yes. And I know it runs counter to what we have all done for many years. It's not something that's super black and white. The way we've applied this at Sutter is to tell all of our architects that yes, the answer is yes on this. You have to provide at least 1 section of counter that is down at an accessible height. And the purpose is if you have somebody from a patient or a patient's family that needs to talk to medical staff and they're a wheelchair user, they may not be able to communicate as clearly. And I realize fully there are counter arguments here. We've been through them all, believe me. Truly, you could have the wheelchair user roll around the side and then talk to the staff kind of eyeball to eyeball. That's why this is not exactly a black and white issue. At the very least, wheelchair users are made to feel like they're a child in an adult world when that counter is way up high and they can't reach the top, they can't use the top surface, they have to roll around. It's not nice. So what we're telling people is that's what you have to do. Code says so because it is effectively a work surface once in a while. And that's really the hinge point here is it or is it not functioning as either a work surface or more, I think more accurately, a sales and service counter? And our answer is yes. And I believe Oshpod's answer will be yes, that in most circumstances, they're going to view that as a sales and service counter. Long answer to a short question. Sorry.
So there does need to be a 36-inch high section of upper shelf.
There needs to be a 36-inch long lower counter.
Okay.
Does that make sense? What else you
Yeah.
got?
At a nurse station with a standing counter, such as the one you just discussed, located on the corridor side, with the standing counter, it says with the standing counter also need a lower portion. And I think you answered that. There's a transaction
Yes.
requirement, so we answered that.
Yeah.
There's a couple of bonus ones here.
Bonus. Okay.
We'll go more into sinks here. I think we're beyond cabinets. I'll answer those online here. But on the sink ones, what is the minimum sink depth? It's a good question. Is it 17 inches or 19 inches? And more to the question, I have been asked to make it 19 inches based on the toe clearance shall extend 19 inches minimum under sinks required to be accessible by section 11B 212.3. We may need to
So
pull up the code on this.
yeah, this is deep into my memory. So this is what this revolves around is defining, is it a sink or is it a lavatory? This is the whole point of that part of this seminar. There's two different requirements there. The toe depth requirement for a lavatory is 17-inch minimum, 19-inch maximum. If you define it as a sink, it's 19-inch minimum, 25-inch maximum. So are you washing your hands and face at that fixture or something else? That's the best I could do.
Yeah, the question is not specific. So if it's a hand wash fixture, let's see if we can answer it that way. What would be the appropriate sink depth for say an acute care setting, hand
So if
wash
it's a hand
fixture?
washing fixture, it'll be classified as a lavatory. The requirements for a lavatory are 17 to 19 inches of depth. I'm gonna see if I can find the slide. We're on slide 160. So this is the slide here. The toe space at lavatories is 17 to 19 inches deep. At sinks, dining, and work surfaces, it's 19 to 25. Now, I can't cite for you the code citations. That whole conversation is a long and twisted conversation. That's the short answer.
Okay, I think at the end we could go back. They've cited 11B 212.3. I'll leave the question open, but I think that should address the majority of like what the applications folks have.
All right, so that was our 5-minute break. So I hope this isn't an imposition on those of you that are watching at home. So this should be, I think, an interesting section. We're going to break down the requirements by room type. So you can see, and I know again, you guys are architects, you're going to relate to this, I think, more intuitively than words on the building code. So starting off with exam rooms, the general exam room, when we talked about the code requirements, now let's look at a layout, and I'm going to talk through all the specific requirements kind of one at a time. This one I'm going to go into a lot of detail on, and then not as much detail on the other ones, so much because we're going to piggyback on what we talk about here. So first, a little bit of credit where credit is due. This floor plan layout is what, actually all the ones that we're going to go through. Our planning group at Sutter has developed these as a team. So I am in a part of Sutter where we have 150 people, more or less, that do building design and construction management. Within that big group, there's the 12 of us that are in the planners group, and it's our job, Bill Whipple and myself are 2 out of the 12. We team together in doing this kind of planning stuff. My role in that is the accessibility piece and maybe OSHPD liaison stuff. So our team came up with this. And of course, we all want to make healthcare more affordable. We're trying to get these rooms as small as we can. And of course, it ended up, I'm the guy raising my hand saying, from an accessibility standpoint, you can't make it any smaller because you run into access problems. So let me go through this one piece at a time. So first, the patient comes in the room. We have an access aisle requirement. As we talked about earlier, code allows you to do just one side only. That's clear and easy enough to understand. The second component here is the accessible route through the room. So it's a little bit loosey-goosey. You're required by code to have a 36-inch aisle accessible route. The way we've designed it, it passes right through where we have a stool and that wall-mounted computer that we talked about earlier. We accept the stool is light enough, you can kick it out of the way, we're not gonna worry about it. And the wall-mounted EHR is something that could fold up against the wall, we're not gonna worry about it. So we've got an accessible route that takes us through to the guest chair. Then we've got turning space requirements. By code, we're required to either have a turning T or a turning circle. We've got that. Then we've got a 30 by 48 inch clear floor space at each fixture. That's easy enough. Then we've got the door clearance. So of note, what Sutter has done in the past couple of years, we've moved to a standard where we use the barn door. Perfectly acceptable, perfectly code compliant. We have had some questions on the force to open the door. There are some manufacturers where they've built in a dampening feature so the door doesn't slam on one end of its run or the other, and that creates additional friction, and you have to overcome that. The 5-pound force thing is tough to resolve. But the clearance requirements, going with the barn door saves us some space that you would otherwise be required for a swinging door. So this helps us get it smaller and tighter. Now we've got the protruding object issue. So this is where it gets a little wild and a little squirrely. So you probably all remember that from your code days, the protruding object requirement is 4 inches off of a wall into a circulation path. So it's all about, does it protrude into a circulation path or not? So if we say these are our circulation paths shown in yellow, then do we or do we not have protruding objects into those circulation paths? So as we look at this design of this room, we've got this kind of a orangey brown color showing the sharps disposal, paper towel dispenser, the glove box dispenser, the otoscope, the computer. Those are potentially protruding objects. Now, this is a smallish room. To take a step back on the protruding object issue, we talked about this at lunch a little bit, that the essence of this is to protect people who are sight impaired from a hazard, from walking into a protruding object. We've asked these questions to the US Access Board that in a small room, like a little bathroom sized room or an exam room, does it really apply there? And could we have some mobile cart underneath that takes away the issue of it being not cane detectable? And they've told us no. So in that context, it's sort of a black and white thing for them. So we kind of, so to speak, have rolled our eyes because honestly, there's not much of a sense that people are really going to hurt themselves by walking around in our room, that a nursing staff is going to escort you to the room, have you sit down in the guest chair, and a patient who's sight impaired is very unlikely to spontaneously jump up out of their chair and start walking around the room and injure themselves on this stuff. It's just not a significant risk. So here's what I've done with this. The reason I'm giving you the long setup, I've created a concept. I've just made this up myself. It is the wall of things. So the wall of things, in our case, we've got a whole wall where we've got a mobile cart, we've got waste cans, we've got the hand washing fixture and stuff. The point is any one of them could be taken out, but as a grouping, it defines the edge of where my circulation path is. So I'm not just throwing away the building code and saying, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to. We're saying we're going to comply with the building code, but the way we're doing it, we're going to say, but our circulation path is not right up against the edge of the wall. We have not received any pushback from OSHPD, local building officials, or any of our access specialists on this. So while I've made up the concept of the wall of things, it's not too crazy. So that's how we finesse our protruding object issue. And that's, I think, the toughest issue for us. Now, we have, for the record, we have tried. We have tried and tried and tried. We have done some crazy stuff where we put a little fin on the wall, like a little plastic fin that sticks out 6 inches and flexible so that it would go boing when you sling it to the side. And that would be a cane detectable thing. And sure enough, within a week of operation, cleaning staff or others accidentally knocked it off the wall. We have gone to great lengths to try to get the protruding object issue resolved, and this is what we feel is a reasonable approach. So that may bring up some questions. The computer folds up against the wall. So before I move off from this, Mr. Bill Whipple, do we have any questions?
We do not on, oh wait, here we go. Our OSHPD CO wouldn't accept computer arm in the circulation path.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things going on there. And maybe I know too much about OSHPD, but the way things are supposed to work, and OSHPD has a policy on this, and it's a printed policy. The COs are not supposed to go out there and say, well, I am going to apply the code in the way that I want to, and here's what I think. They're supposed to go back to the approved drawings and say, that's what was approved by the folks in the office. And if they don't agree with the folks in the office, they have an internal process to work it out. They're not supposed to just spring this on you when you're under construction. I doubt, I mean, the truth is with OSHPD, they don't yet have anybody that I would say is their accessibility guru. And I don't mean that as any kind of a criticism. It's just they don't have a position like that at OSHPD. And I don't know that they've got somebody who unofficially fills that role. So the question of is that code compliant or is that not is up to the 12 to 15 different plan check senior architects that do the plan review. And the last thing I'll say is I empathize with you. Whoever is asking the question, boy, oh boy, do I empathize with you. Next question.
Well, to follow up a little bit, ultimately at OSHPD, if there was a challenge, would it eventually end up with Richard Tannehill in this particular instance?
Most likely it would. Yeah, Richard Tannehill is the building standards unit supervisor. He's an architect. He's an architect that we've worked with in the small world that it is. Richard Tannehill and I have almost traded places. He's an architect that used to do work on Sutter facilities quite a bit. And my point is, he knows real world stuff. He's empathetic to all of what we do. He's a logical guy and a reasonable guy. When you go through the paces of appealing, almost certainly it would end up ultimately with him. Nonetheless, you know, yeah, this computer that's mounted on the wall, it is a subjective code issue. What we've tried to do, as I mentioned earlier, is put it on the back side of the room so that you would approach it from a forward approach so that your cane would hit the wall before your belly hit the protruding object. And I got to tell you, this is the first time I've heard of anybody at OSHPD raising that as an issue. So you may be dealing with a maverick at OSHPD that kind of wants to write their own rules and interpret it their own way. But I didn't say that. Okay. So what else we got?
All right. How do you justify the wall of things in a blind person setup not going in that direction and out of the circulation path as defined by your layout? Ooh. So not
So if they
using this
approach it,
room example. Yeah.
so two things there. If you approach things from the front, you get 12 inches rather than 4. That resolves almost all these issues. The true problem is if you approach it from the side, are you going to hit your shoulder on any of these things? Well, with our wall of things, you're never going to be in a position where you're walking alongside close to that wall and you're going to hit your shoulder on the glove dispenser. So I don't have a problem with telling people I'm perfectly fine with this layout from an access standpoint. It does not put people that are sight impaired at risk.
So just to summarize, Bill, if you approach from the front, you get 12 inches of profile. If you approach from the side, you get
4
uh,
inches.
4 inches.
Yeah, the code language isn't as clear on that as it used to be. The 12 inches, I believe they've changed the language and now it's like a post mounted thing. So I don't know that you would actually, I mean, you could have a building official that says, well, that's not what the code actually says. In practical terms, that's the way it works though. Somebody who's a cane user would hit the wall long before they actually bump their belly into any of those things if they're approaching it from the front. So
Um,
what else? We've got about an hour for the remainder of the seminar,
okay.
but I think we're doing fine. So what else have we got?
In regards to equal facilitation, if you provide a stand-on scale in the exam room, would you also need to provide a wheelchair scale in the exam room? Get this
Aha,
all day
yeah.
long.
So we're into an issue here, gets kind of complicated. So the Sutter standard, we take this this issue very seriously. We need to weigh people in an equal manner. This may not be obvious to everybody. So what happens from time to time is we put standing scales in the rooms. I say we in a loose way, I'm using the term loosely. What we have seen happen is where there is then a wheelchair scale that's out in the corridor in a little alcove, and everybody gets to watch you while you get weighed. That's not nice to do to people. And so we would argue that's not equal. Everybody gets to be weighed privately in the room except the people that are wheelchair users, and then it's a public spectacle. That's not equal. So you need to work your arrangement of how you do the scale thing so that you don't run into that issue. Now, what we've got here, our exam table, I'm going to get into this in about another 10 to 15 slides. The exam table, in our case, there's a feature, and it's an optional feature. We'll have a weighing mechanism in it, so you can put the patient on the exam table and weigh them on the exam table. The exam table itself weighs them. So that tends to get us out of this issue. Um, so what else? Other questions?
Uh, in a nurse station, the facility, so back to the nurse station, the
Okay.
facility is looking to install an infant security panel that lights up when there is a door alarm. There is an operable button to reset the alarm on that panel. Does this need to meet the reach ranges? This would make it more difficult for the nurses to see the panel lights. Very good question.
Yeah, I keep saying down in the weeds. I don't know if that's the right way to characterize this. It's a very specific application of these requirements. So as I've kind of laid it out, we're not of the mind to say that anything and everything that a staff member does has to be an accessible height. That takes you to a strange and crazy place. So we're willing to, and we believe it's legally defendable to say that our staff Things that are used strictly by staff and strictly for their work duty can be at a higher height. Now, if there's the prospect of mounting it at 48 inches so everybody can use it, why not do that? If there's a reason that you want to have it up at 54 inches that makes a lot of sense, I think we could defend it. What
I think we'll
else?
have to come back later to a sync question that's lingering. I think
Okay.
that's it for now, Bill.
Okay. So we are going to take all of what we've talked about in the general exam room and then apply it to all of the other room types. So the mammography room, we talked about this a little bit before, but now let's look at a room layout for mammography. So again, you come in from the door, you've got your accessible route to the equipment. You have to then provide a 30 by 48 inch clear space at the point at which the patient interacts with the equipment. Now, I've been told, but I don't know from firsthand experience, that you need to operate this at times at an angle. So you may very well need to actually provide some clear space so it can be approached from the sides. We tend to not have much of an issue with that, but where we do run into problems is on the access to the console. You have to provide access for the staff to get through to where they do their work duty at the console. So the accessible route requirement is 36 inches, which is allowed to skinny up to 32 inches at a point. This does come up from time to time because we all try to push that console back into the corner as much as we can. And there is a point at which you can't go any deeper. So we've got that. Now an ultrasound room. So our layout, one of our kind of standard Sutter layouts. As you recall, now you have to provide access on two sides because it's not a general exam room. So we've got that. Now there's something unique going on here. Most all of you, I'm sure, know the ultrasound process requires, as part of the way you operate and you deliver medicine, the ultrasound unit has to be right there. It has to be right next to the table. There's no way around it. So what we're doing is providing a home base for the ultrasound unit so that if we have a patient who has a certain left hand or right hand bias, if they need to use this side of the table to get on and off of the exam table or the ultrasound table, then we can roll away the ultrasound unit to the side. So we want to have a home base for that. And this is what we're telling our architects. Be sure to design in a spot where that could go if we need to. So that's the essence that's unique in that room. Now the stress test room is another different kind of thing. So in this case, you come in the room. So then where you get on and off of the treadmill, this is not a lounge table. This is not an exam table. This is not a gurney. So you do not have to provide a 36-inch aisle on both sides, and it doesn't make sense to provide it on both sides. For the patient is going to get on and off at the foot of the treadmill. So that's where we believe, that's where you put your clear floor space. So then the patient goes on the treadmill, does their thing, then very quickly they come off of the treadmill and onto the echo table. And this is a debatable thing. So I'd like to tell you that that one side only is what you're required by code to have, but in fact, you're going to have to provide access on the second side. Now, we're getting into using up an awful lot of real estate. So we've got the same ultrasound machine issue on this. And personally, I'm willing to accept that the ultrasound machine will be living in a space that's technically in that second clearance area. And I accept this simply because the nature of the stress test room, the nature of what they're doing, it's not that you couldn't possibly do this for somebody who's a wheelchair user, but it's got to be an awful, awful rare occurrence. So the actual need to get on and off of the echo table from both sides, I'm willing to bend a little and let that ultrasound machine live in that space. If we have to, we could roll it out of the way and roll it back again. So we're going to show OSHPD we have clearance on both sides of the echo table. Questions? Do we have any questions that have come up at that point? We're dealing with some real specific stuff here.
Nope, not specific to the, oh wait, hold on, we do.
Late breaking news.
Yes, and I think you know where this question is coming from, or who might have asked it. The ultrasound machine is shown on the wrong side of the patient.
Oh, terrible thing.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll fix that.
We'll fix that. Thank you. Holy cow. Okay, what else have we got?
I think that's it for this room.
Well, we'll keep moving on. In the emergency treatment room. So this is a treatment room by code. You have to have access on both sides of the treatment table or whatever, however we refer to it, the gurney. That's easy enough. Now, where we run into trouble is the wall of things all over again. So what we do, we tell our architects and design teams, put all of your stuff, all those monitors on one side. So as you can see from the slide here, there's all kinds of monitors and gadgets that are necessary for medical treatment that we have to have in the room. These all constitute protruding objects. So what we want to do, I want to go back a slide, is try to group them either at the head of the bed or along one side where I can call it my wall of things. And if possible, put either a counter underneath all of it or have a series of trash cans and carts and other such stuff so that I can legitimately say my circulation path does not run up against the wall edge. That's a toughie though. I gotta admit, I've been in an emergency room with a family member. I actually snapped these pictures when sitting in one of our Sutter facilities in the ER going, hey, that's not compliant, and that's not compliant, and that's not compliant. Now, this was built a long time ago. It is what it is, but we can do better for our future projects. So I'm gonna go on. Questions, anything else have come up?
Generally, I take on the rule or the thought that maybe I shouldn't critique the buildings when I'm in receiving clinical care, but
Yeah, yes. Yeah, the doctors do
drive
not.
the staff crazy.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Joe asked a question much earlier today, and I want to make sure we address this. This is a big question. So it had to do with protruding objects, and he was citing 11B 307.2.
Okay.
And it says it limits the protrusions in the circulation paths, and it's by definition he's saying it does not include rooms. So let's address that, Bill, if you can.
I may want to hold that to a little bit later because what I want to do is pull up the code section. When he says it doesn't include rooms, we were specifically told the opposite from the US Access Board. We asked that question. I mean, I personally, and I've sat down and I've talked to the guy, Rex Pace at the US Access Board. They've explained it in detail. They apply it in rooms. Now, I'm putting this in the context of doing this stuff throughout my career. Back in the day, the language was different and it referred to corridors and sidewalks, and it led one to believe you're moving along at a fairly fast pace with your cane. It's evil to put a protruding object that sticks out into a sidewalk or into a corridor. It's relatively new in the code world, relatively new. that it's been applied in rooms. And that's where we have struggled and struggled and struggled to come up with a way of designing where that's not an issue for us. It's a tough one. It really is a tough one. So I'll pull up the code section. I don't want to go out of PowerPoint, pull up the code, and then go back to PowerPoint. It's too messy, but I'll answer that at the end of the whole presentation.
Fantastic.
All right, let's go to the blood draw station. So this again is a slightly different version of all of this. So here's our Sutter standard layout. What we do in a blood draw station. So we've talked to people. We've had actually, I've had the distinct advantage of being able to talk to our medical staff, our nurse practitioners, doctors, and medical staff. We pretty much never transfer a patient from a wheelchair to a blood draw chair. It's not necessary, and it's overly complicates the process. So they're going to stay almost certainly in their chair. So as we design this, then what we want to do is keep in mind the patient's going to come in and they need to have a place where you put them while you do the blood draw. And you don't want it to end up being something that you didn't think about. And so now they're in the middle of a corridor or something. So that's the operation there. And then a second version of that. So of course, there are people that you take their blood and they faint. So we want to lay them down on an exam table. So now we're back to what kind of feels like an exam room arrangement. We're going to lay them down on an exam table. You could argue that you're only obligated to have a one side only because it's very much like an exam room. You may or may not win that argument. So our standard design is to have room in the layout so that we have an aisle on both sides. So that's the blood draw room. And I'm gonna blow by and do the accessible patient bedroom. So we've seen this earlier, so I won't spend too much time on it. You come in from the door, you have to go to both sides. That's business as usual. As we talked earlier, you have your home base requirement. Nothing especially new there. Okay, CT scan room. I think this came up during our lunch questions. So our layout that we have, one of our standard layouts is shown on screen. So the patient comes in the room, they need to be able to get both sides. Now this is an accessibility thing. This is not the OSHPD requirement that separately says that you have to have a 36-inch clearance around all of the whole piece of equipment. Now I am showing here the clearance at it effectively is the foot of the bed. You have to be able to move around it with a 36-inch aisle so you can get to both sides. Now, our experience has been through all of this, most of the time, our most serious issues are in the exam rooms. And the reason is the CT scan rooms, all of these other specialized rooms, they tend to be much bigger rooms. And by code, you have to have a certain sized room for the radiology operations. So we end up having plenty of room for accessibility. Exam rooms, those are the ones we find we are really struggling with to get them just right and meet all the access requirements. Now, I'm going to go back to the exam room thing. So now we're going to talk about the convertible exam chair. This is a whole nother layering over this topic. So many of you have probably already run into this. New generation of exam tables actually starts out very much looking like a chair. So what I'm showing you is a Midmark. This is the Midmark 626. It's got all the bells and whistles. I believe you can purchase it with more or less bells and whistles. Like I noted earlier, for a certain price, you can buy the ability to weigh the patient right on the exam table. They actually move. I think that photo in the lower right-hand corner is showing that you can press a certain gizmo and then you can roll the chair quite easily from here to there and move it around surprisingly well. Now, just for the sake of letting you know how this seminar usually works, what we've done for the last couple of years, we've had Midmark come to my seminar in Berkeley and then the other one that I give here in Sacramento, and they've brought this exam chair. And we've actually demonstrated live for all the participants to see a transfer from one of our staff who's a wheelchair user, and we've had one of our staff who's a nurse at Alta Bates kind of explain the whole process that you need to be aware of. And truly, this was interesting stuff that I didn't know. One thing I'll share with you. So Yomi Wrong from our staff was the patient who's a wheelchair user. So she has an electric wheelchair that has kind of a little joystick that you use to move the wheelchair forward and backward and left and right. So she explained for her, that's almost an extension of your body. That's a very personal thing, and it's your lifeline. So she's explained you transfer, and at times staff that aren't really sensitive to the issue go, oh, hey, I'll move your wheelchair over there to the other side of the room. And she's like, no, don't do that. I want my chair right here. I want it right here. I wouldn't have known that. I wouldn't have known that that's what people go through as they go through the process of transferring. In any case, let me get into our architectural drawings. Oh, I'm sorry. First, I've got the accessible medical equipment. So I spoke this morning about the AME standards. So this is a 200 to 300 page document. A couple of people at Sutter were actually on the committee that developed these. What they effectively are doing is establishing that the height that an accessible exam chair needs to be at needs to align with the kind of standardized height of a wheelchair. And the points of transfer would be either at that end point or at the midpoint, and you may or may not have grab bars. So I'm not going to take you through all of that stuff other than to mention that as we did our layout, that's part of our thinking on this, that we've got this kind of a chair. So now as we break it down, that piece of the graphic, so this is just a graphic that we got from the manufacturer for the purposes of our AutoCAD or Revit type drawings that shows the footprint of the exam table. What that actually is showing us that this end part is the foot that pulls out. The second part is truly the seat where the transfer occurs. And then that end part is more of the back that folds down. So when we do our code compliant full length of the table, we have to assume it's to be considered as in its full outstretched version. We have to provide a 36-inch aisle along the full length. And now as OSHPD has interpreted it in their CAN 2-11B, we have to have an access along the foot of it that's also 36 inches. Now, one other point I want to make here. So this is our standard room that we're working with. So my friend Bill Whipple can back me up on this. We had quite the interesting discussion about this on one of our iterations of using this layout for other types of services, and specifically OBGYN. So when you take the standard exam table and you put on the end of it the stirrups, you're now limiting your space by another maybe 1.5 feet. I don't know. Bill Whipple, what do you think? 1.5 to 2 feet?
Well, I don't think I'm the expert on that one, but yes.
Okay.
And I think this is a real challenge that another one of the planners within Sutter Health faced in a recently completed clinic, because you not only have a clearance requirement, you actually have some usability challenges and durability challenges at the back of the room, hitting the wall with the provider hitting the wall with their chair. So there's quite a bit going on here.
Right, right. And so that's kind of the point I'm driving at. We all want to make these rooms as small as we can get them for efficiency and cost, but you've got to think through these kind of specifics. And we found ourselves trying to rationalize, well, and the patient is on the chair. Do we really need that access aisle? And I would encourage you, don't take the bait on that. You'll regret it later. So design it as small as you can, but keep in mind your specific needs. So that's a little bit of a sidebar to the discussion about this particular type of convertible exam chair, exam table. Now, I think the last thing I'm going to say on this, from our experience, patients transfer almost always in the seated posture. I don't know that we hardly ever have a patient come into a room horizontal and then try to transfer horizontally. It's almost always at a seated posture. So just keep in mind as we work through the reality of all of this, that's what it looks like. So I want to pause at this point for questions. Do we have any questions built up?
Yeah, so we have 7 questions, and I think
Okay.
some we can answer, and they're questions that came up earlier in the day. But in the early portion of the slide deck, um, we can go back to some unisex toilet labeling part of the slide deck.
Okay.
And so it says, discuss California requirement for unisex signage at a single occupancy toilet versus the OSHPD male and female. So is it?
So the building code requirement for unisex toilet rooms, what I'll say, the room name, you can call it whatever you want. The code doesn't tell you, you have to call it this. We choose to use restrooms or toilet rooms. So that's part of your signage for that. The ISA you have to provide if it's accessible. The male and female figures, as I mentioned earlier, they are optional. You can choose to do whatever you want. There is out there the male and female figure where somebody has combined the two and did a half skirt, half slacks. A lot of people find that to be in poor taste. I wouldn't recommend it. So I think that where this takes us is the only thing really that's in question is the geometric symbols on the face of the door. And that's going to be a triangle and circle both. That's the unisex, gender neutral symbol. That's it.
Just to drive that point home, do you mind going to that section of the slide? I think you had an image that was the circle and triangle.
All right, let me see. That was morning session, right?
Yep. And that's on the door.
That's a lot of slides we've covered today.
There it is.
So that is what you have to do. That's gender neutral. Don't get hung up at the terminology. Unisex is the same for these purposes as saying gender neutral. So we've had discussions with DSA and the specific people, Ida Claire over at DSA, who's now the acting state architect. And she has gone on at length to explain this, that the building code doesn't get into all of that. The building code says, if you're going to make it unisex, then you have to provide both the male and female symbol, and here's how you do it. But the gender neutral law, none of that's in the building code. So we've got a little over a half hour left. I want to make sure we get through some good, important material. Can we hold the questions, unless they're specific to this exam room thing, the convertible chair? I can come back to all kinds of stuff after 3 o'clock, and I'll stay as long as people want to keep asking questions. What do you think, Mr. Bill Whipple?
That sounds good. Just to confirm, Bill, if you go back to the agenda real quick. Beginning.
Yeah.
Make sure you get your times correct. We are at 2:25.
Yeah, so we're supposed to be out at 3 o'clock.
Okay.
So I'm going to go through some special issues, and I may be able to rip through those quickly, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to make an call an audible here. Rather than doing the game show, I hate to do this to you. I'm sorry. We're pressed for time, so I'm going to blow up. I was going to do some questions, which more or less goes back over the same material we've already covered. In order to get to some important stuff, I want to blow that off and just go straight to the next section. So, unless there's a mutiny, here's what we're doing. Are we good with this, Bill?
Looking good.
Okay.
I
So-
like game shows though.
Yeah, I know. Well, so we've got Teresa Endres, who started us off this morning, who put some time and effort into creating a poll so we can do these questions, and I just cut it from the agenda, so I apologize, Teresa.
It's okay.
Okay. So this, I think, is some of the most valuable stuff that we're going to talk about today. Not that the rest of it wasn't, but this is specific to healthcare, and there's some real issues that you got to be aware of. So this first one is a forced to open issue, and this may not be obvious to you all how big of a deal it is. So I want to explain this to you. First, the code citations. So you've probably been through this before many times. The code section we're dealing with is 404.2.9, the force required to open doors. 5 pounds for interior, 5 pounds for sliding or folding, 5 pounds for exterior doors, and you get a 15-pound exception for required fire doors. That's the one that we want to talk about. That is a trap. So I don't know how many of you are Star Wars people. The minute I wrote on my slide, it's a trap, this came to mind for me, the Star Wars, it's a trap. So folks, this is the way I want you to remember it. It's a memorable slide. This is a trap. So let me unpack this. The code says, hey, you're allowed to go up to 15 pounds if it's a fire rated door. There's also a section of code that defines accessibility. Accessible by definition must be usable by persons with a disability. So we're in kind of a double jeopardy. You could point to a code section and say, yeah, but this is a fire rated door. It's allowed to go up to 15 pounds. Folks, I gotta tell you, we get complaints about this. And a 15-pound door is way heavier than somebody with a disability or somebody who has limited energy or abilities, possibly due to a medical condition. They're not going to be able to open it. So we have had this happen. We have had complaints. What I want to share with you is kind of a lessons learned and where this has gone wrong. So I have a case study we're dealing with right now. And I will not share with you the names or the facilities to protect the innocent, but this is an ongoing thing. We have a facility, a large facility we just opened about a year ago. And within a few months of opening it, we have an ADA complaint about the force to open doors. And you can imagine, as I've talked to our people about this, how management wanted to know, how can we have possibly ended up here where we have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on a brand new facility, built to code, checked by OSHPD, and when we're finished, You're telling me it's not ADA compliant? How could that possibly be? Folks, it is. So let me go through this. What I've done is gone out to this facility myself. I've taken this tool where you do the measuring. This is kind of like a pencil with a gauge. You push that black rubber end against the door and push the door open, and the little rubber thing in the middle, that moves up and down on the piston, and it tells you how many pounds of force it takes to open the door. It's not a super accurate thing, but it is what an awful lot of us in the industry use. So I've gone out to the facility. We had two types of doors where we were having issues. The garage doors, so this has a parking garage down below, which has 2 or 3 separate entrances into the elevator lobby. These doors are how you get in to the elevator lobby and then go up to our building. These doors measured 10 to 12 pounds. That is way heavier than somebody who's a wheelchair user will ever be able to open. The second area of sensitivity is in the patient toilet rooms at each floor level. So we're dealing with what was once male and female, now is in our current world, they're gender neutral. So we've got 2 toilet rooms at each floor level. As you get off the elevator and come around the corner, there's 2 toilet rooms. I think this particular one is a multi-user because it's still got the male, or they haven't put the gender neutral thing on yet. I'm not sure which. In any case, these ones, I measured a whole bunch of them. They're all coming in at 8 to 12 pounds of force. So the nuance here, in a lot of cases, like this particular one, it's fairly easy to open the door, the latch, and push your way in a wheelchair. Now, when it's time to get back out, pulling the door toward you to open it is a far more complicated process. It's very difficult to operate the latch, pull the door towards you and back up in your wheelchair, and then maneuver your way around the door. That is a very complicated process. So people are getting trapped in our toilet room, and it happened to this particular person. I've talked to the guy on multiple occasions, the complainant in this case. He's a very nice guy, very reasonable. So where this has taken us, this is a big deal. We're going to spend somewhere in the range of over $1 million putting in automatic door openers in a brand new building. So I would caution all of you, the particular areas of concern that I'm listing on the bottom of the slide: main entry doors, rehab facilities, physical therapy facilities, and toilet rooms. I'm not saying put a door opener on every single door. And believe me, I had that conversation internally with some devil's advocates internal to Sutter, that you can't possibly be saying you're going to put a door opener on every door. No, not every door, just some select doors. And as it is, it's adding up to be a big number. So that's our horror story. And this is not the only facility I've had this complaint at. We've received this complaint in multiple facilities. So as I've said, this 15-pound fire-rated door thing, that's a trap, especially those of you that represent building owners. Don't let your teams talk you into the expedient solution, which is to claim that exception. Anyway, I think I've made my point on this. Before I go to the next topic, do we have any questions this has generated?
Not on this particular subject.
Okay, then I'm going to move on. So the hospital tub and shower rooms. So there's a code nuance I simply want to make you all aware of. Special bathing facilities. So this is not in the accessibility portions of the code. This is in 1224.14. These are special bathing facilities. So what that is, I'm going to back up, and just a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a room that's designed so that the staff can bathe the patient, or the patient is not able to bathe themselves. And there's an essential point to understand right there that accessibility is all about making our buildings so that people with disabilities can use them by themselves without having to ask for special help. So when you're designing a special bathing facility per this code requirement, understand that's not the same thing. That's not designing a shower that you need to make handicap accessible. That's a whole other thing. Now, on the right side of the screen, I've got the code requirements that apply for toilets and bathing rooms. What I've shown in the red text, so that's a different iteration and a different thing. The point I want to drive home there, this code requirement says that you shall have one lavatory and one water closet in addition to the shower or bathtub. So I think I can explain this better with a slide that shows a floor plan. If you're doing the special bathing facility, this is how it looks, more or less schematically. It's not for self-bathing. If you're doing a self-bathing, now nobody does this anymore, but 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we used to design hospitals that had a shower out in the corridor, and everybody would use that shower. Now, nobody does it that way. But if you're in the unfortunate circumstance of remodeling one of those, and they're going to maintain that shower or bathtub for multiple patients to use, what you need to understand is the accessibility portions of code mandate that you have in along with the shower, you have to have a toilet and lav. So this is the biology working thing. So when you feel running water, okay, that may get your juices flowing and you have to go use the toilet. What the code is acknowledging in an accessibility arena is that maybe you and I can towel off real quick and get out of the shower room and into the hallway and down to our patient bedroom and go in and use our bathroom that's in our patient bedroom. It's a mean and not nice thing to do to somebody who's a wheelchair user, to ask them to, in the middle of using the shower, now they have to towel off, real quick transfer to a bench, then to their wheelchair, get out the door into the corridor, and it's by the time they get there, it's too late. So code requires, if you have a shower room, you have to have a toilet and a lavatory there in that room. And that one, if you don't catch that nuance, you can stumble into it and not realize it. And suddenly the building officials are going to tell you, oh, no, you need to make this twice as big as it is now. So that's that one. Okay, bed pan washers versus grab bars. So this one comes up a lot. It might be of note to let you know, I've done this seminar prior with Glenn Gall from OshPod on a couple of occasions, and he's backed me up on this. He's got up on his soapbox to make the pitch. So let me walk you through the code requirements on this. So there's clinic sink requirements in the building code. By code, in a med-surg unit, you have to have a clinical sink in the utility room, in the soiled utility room. There's an exception in the plumbing code that says you can delete that clinic sink if and only if you provide bedpan flushing devices in each and every patient room. That's a choice that the architect and the architect's client, the building owner or the healthcare provider, make themselves. OshPod is not making you do that. It's a choice that you make. So meanwhile, back at the ranch under accessibility, the grab bar requirements have this exception number 2 that says where an administrative authority requires flush controls, yada, yada, yada. So OSHPD is saying emphatically, we are not requiring you to do this stuff. You're choosing to do it. So OSHPD is not going to allow you to split the grab bar or to put the grab bar on one side. Now it occurs to me, I may have glossed over a point. On this slide, it's barely visible. So a bedpan washer, I think I'm going to back up a slide or two. This slide shows it better. On the right, there's kind of a white gizmo on the vertical element. What that is a bedpan washing device. You can pull that down 90 degrees, and it's more or less like a shower head. And then you can flush with that much higher flush valve, and it will wash out the bedpan. You can flush it out right into the toilet. Now, staff love that because they don't want to carry a bedpan with you know what in it down the hall to the soiled utility room to dump it. So where this takes us, you have very, very few alternatives. OSHPD is saying they're not going to allow you to split the grab bar or move it to one side, and they're not going to allow you to put the plumbing in front of the grab bar because that obstructs the use of the grab bar. So your choices almost exclusively come down to using a flexible hose. And I got to point out here on this slide, you have to maintain the area above the grab bar open in the accessible patient rooms. So this is a very complicated little thing to work through. We've gone through this, we've done this just like the photo shows, but I got to tell you, the staff don't like it. And I think the reason they don't, the flexible hose, in order to reach it, they have to reach over the toilet. It's a back strain issue, it's awkward. Nonetheless, this is the best advice I can give you. We touched on this earlier, so I'm not going to go over that again. Nurse call device thing. So I want to pause. I'm going to pick up the privacy curtain issue. But before I go there, do we have any outstanding questions on the recent material I just covered?
There is, not particularly, but there is a question though. If
Okay.
there's a glass door for the shower, does that glass door, is it required to have 18-inch clearance in pulling it open?
Yeah, I have to picture this in my mind. So if you have a shower, and I'm thinking in my mind of almost like a residential shower door, and you pull the shower door toward you, it's functioning as a door to get in and out of the shower. Now I want to step back. No, that's
Let me add another portion to the question here. So let's say it's a 36-inch by 60-inch clear shower. Say it's a shower in an ADA
okay.
patient room. Would you be required, say if you put a door going into that shower, would that door
So,
then need to have clearance in both directions?
well, yes and no. So I want to explain this. There's a whole set of requirements for a shower. Complicated stuff. You have to have the shower seat. There's a whole thing in the code about that. To get in and out of the shower, you have to have one full side of that clear and open. So I don't know how you would ever have a door that you would open in order to get into the shower. If you were to do it, I may not be understanding the total arrangement, but if it's legitimately a door, yeah, all the door requirements would be applicable to the door in all of its glory, the 18-inch side strike and all of that. I have my doubts that there's going to be a way to do that. in the context of still complying with shower requirements. I think you'd have to back up your door way, way, way far, so it's not really opening into the shower, it's opening into a ante area before you get into the shower. What else?
And
What
then
else?
related to the 5 pounds and the door, uh, there's a little bit of dialogue on that, but it appears the only real solution is in those sensitive areas, Bill, is to have auto openers, right? There's no assurance you can get to this 5 pound requirement. And there's some concern that doors won't close, and meaning that those doors, and say in rated conditions or where you have to hit pressure differentials, that if
Yeah,
you don't have enough pounds of closing force, they won't close adequately.
right. I'm glad you brought that up. That, in the interest of trying to get us finished at 3 o'clock, I may have glossed over some of the points there that you're bringing up. So the door closer is pulling the door closed. And specifically when it's a fire rated door, the nuance here is the fire people, it's important to the fire life safety folks that that door closes and latches. So it's got to be a strong enough pull that it latches that door. Well, that tends to bring us out of the 5 pound range. And yet, that's too hard in most cases for that to be operable by somebody who's got a disability or somebody who's simply recovering from a medical treatment, people that are in rehab, um, people who have COPD and other such stuff. Now, I do want to go back to my case study. Um, Again, as you can imagine, we've talked to the project team with a certain sense of indignation in our voice. How could this possibly have happened? And they have assured me, oh my goodness, we went over this over and over and over again to a degree you would not believe, that the Oshpod field staff called them on it during construction and insisted that they adjust their doors as much as they possibly can to come within as close as they can get it down to 5 pounds. And they went to all kinds of degrees of effort to do that. They've found, of course, when you turn the mechanical unit on or off, that will affect the outcome. It either makes it easier or harder to open the door. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this. And in the end, they assured me that they did everything that they could to bring it down to what I found was 10 to 12 pounds. So yeah, that is a tough, tough, tough nut to crack. So I'm going to move on. We'll still pick up some more of the questions after we wrap up. I've got 2 or 3 more sections to go through, and we'll be done with the formal presentation. Privacy curtains, not too big of an issue, but I want to go through this because a couple of things have come up that you may get value out of. So there's maneuvering clearance requirements for doors. Everybody knows that, right? So in the context of talking about privacy curtains, can you or can you not stack those in that door clearance area? I'm sure this is the kind of thing most people don't even consider. And I think we've all said, well, they're awfully, awfully lightweight. I'm not even going to worry about it. I've taken this to our consultants, and they've said, well, not so fast. It would be far better to stack them outside of the required clear area. That when you look at an actual occurrence of where the curtain stacks, that is kind of in that area that's supposed to be kept clear. So you may or may not run into people that call you on this. Our advice is, if at all possible, don't do it. Set up your curtains to stack somewhere where they're not in the required door clearances. So that then took me to another iteration of this. So case study in a PACU, it's post-anesthesia care, where we've got a whole row of recovery bays. So when we look at the recovery bays, we go back to that earlier section of code where we want to keep a 36-inch aisle on both sides, because this is not a general exam room. This is a gurney. So we have to have an aisle on both sides. Not a problem. So when we drop in our curtains shown here in yellow, that should work fine. If we've got a 36 aisle on both sides and a 36-inch wide gurney, 9 feet wide, by code, your recovery area has to be 80 square feet minimum. If it's 9 feet deep, it's 91 square feet. The math works out. We should be good to go. Now, what I want to cover with you then is that's what it looks like when it works. Let me show you a different version of that if we go with a closer spacing. So if we have the right clearance on shown in red and the clearance for the other bay shown in blue, they are allowed to overlap. That's not a problem. By code, code doesn't say you can't overlap your clearances. But what I want to demonstrate is when you drop in those curtains, you've got a practical problem. It's not a code problem, it's a practical issue. When somebody actually wants to use the curtain, you end up with only about 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet on each side of you, which is not really usable by anybody and certainly not usable by somebody in a wheelchair. So there is a practical decision that you all need to confront, that when you drop in your curtains, think through how that's actually going to operate. Eye wash facilities. So this is one of those things that's not really in the code. There is no code section for accessibility that tells you this is the requirement for an eye wash fixture. So what we've done, we've worked with our consultants to develop a consensus that we do this kind of piece by piece. So if somebody's going to use the eye wash, we want to make sure they've got the knee and toe space required. We want to make sure the operable parts are compliant. We want to make sure that the reach range is compliant. And then we've got the eye wash spout height. So this is debatable, and it's something that we've considered and determined the closest thing that we have in code to this is a drinking fountain, which has a 36-inch height requirement. So that's what we have done as Sutter to apply. We've seen others do it also. We've checked with our consultants. That seems to be a bit of a consensus, although it is not written into code. But we wanted to share with you that's what we do. So this came up in kind of a big way on our pharmacy projects we did about 1.5 years ago. This drawing is taken from that. Long story short, 36-inch height to the eye wash, bubbler height, and make sure if it's one of these things that you pull it down from the back wall to use it and push it back up, you got to have it comply to the reach range requirements. So that's that topic. And then the last topic I want to cover is the detectable warnings. So this is an interesting topic, and it's in play right now. DSA is doing an outstanding job of rewriting these code sections. It's working its way through the Building Standards Commission now. Now, I believe DSA is on their 3rd iteration of this, meaning they wrote up some changes. It got shot down. They gave it a second shot. It got shot down again. And they're on their 3rd iteration. Hopefully 3rd time's a charm. I have spoke to this issue as part of those hearings. I've had an issue with one piece of it, but the rest of it I think is truly outstanding. So I want to go through the code sections because this is so frequently misunderstood. The issues we run into, it's the hazardous vehicular area requirements. So I know you guys have probably run into this before. So I want to cut to the chase. One of the issues is the color. Now, where this is headed, it's going to be yellow. What DSA is working through as a change to the current code language is that they will be yellow. Yellow, 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 yellow. That's it. You won't have any other choices. What's in the code right now is you can go through a formula where you compare the color of your detectable warnings against the color of the paving that are adjacent. And then if it meets the formula, then you're allowed to do it. That's a mess. It's very hard as an architect to predict what is going to be the color reflectance, the light reflectance value of paving that hasn't been poured yet. And I'm supposed to know that in order to do the math on this. So that's a loser. Yellow is where it's headed. I'm all in favor of it. Let's just go with yellow. Now, the hazardous vehicular area, that's the piece that we want to talk about. First, you got to understand there is no such thing as a non-hazardous vehicular area. People have tried to debate this and say, well, in my version of this, the cars are only moving 2 miles an hour. Is that really hazardous? Well, the jury is in. They've said if a car can be there, it's going to be defined as hazardous. Don't even go there. So understanding that, then where I go with this is to define the hazardous vehicular area on your drawings, or at least on what I would say your schematic design drawings to develop how you want to handle it. What I would do is define your entire parking area as your hazardous vehicular area. So I'm going to walk you through kind of a quick case study to make the point. So we have a parking garage in this particular facility. What I would do is say, look, this area here in the upper blue corner is blue. That is my stair and elevator lobby. That's where the people are coming from. My parking lot, the parking garage, that whole area, I'm going to say the whole darned thing is my hazardous vehicular area. And therefore, the joint where I need to put the detectable warnings, it's just the joint between those two areas. From my perspective, I just don't get any logic out of saying somebody gets out of their car in the middle of the parking garage and we need to somehow warn them that there's other cars around them. I believe they already get that. When you get out of an automobile in your car, from out of a car, you know there's other cars around you. You know you're in a hazardous vehicular area. You don't need to be warned. So with that in mind, I'm going to take kind of a closer look. If we've got our hazardous vehicular area and the blue stair and elevator tower, the place where we want to put detectable warnings is there, that diagonal. That's what makes sense to me. Now, we've seen out there both building officials and architects that do crazy, crazy stuff where they put detectable warnings at the head and foot of each of the access aisles and each of the ADA parking stalls. That doesn't make any sense. This, we believe, makes sense. Now, you could make an argument that people collect on this collector pathway and then they approach it. So maybe you could say you should put a detectable warning at that juncture there where I've got the question mark. In fact, on this project, that's what the building officials made us do. And that I can accept, not too big of a deal. Now, if I had my choice, I wouldn't do it. What I definitely would not do is say that on either side of the walkway, you need to protect yourself from all of the possibilities. Obviously, as you can see, that gets crazy, crazy stuff. So we don't want to do that. Last point or two I want to make. The detectable warnings, the first class way to do this is not put them on top of your paving, but to instead mount them flush. They create a pretty significant trip hazard. This is a recommendation. Code does not speak to that other than saying your vertical requirement is a 1/4 inch vertical and a 1/4 inch at a beveled angle. And then finally, almost finally, I think I've got 2 other slides here, the ambulance entrance discussion. So if you read the literal words in the code, they would suggest that at an ambulance entry, you have to put detectable warnings between the place where the cars are and the place where the people are. I would argue that is craziness. You don't want to have some scenario where somebody has been in a horrible accident, they put them in an ambulance, they take them out and put them on a gurney, and then they roll it over the detectable warnings. That's just horrible, horrible stuff. So what I would recommend, and what we do at Sutter, we design it so that the entrance is strictly for ambulance access. And as long as we can tell that to OSHPD, that we have no public access, no public exit, this is strictly for ambulance drop off. And therefore, we would like to not put detectable warnings in here. And so far, the answer has been in agreement with us every time. Last thing I wanted to cover, if you're going to have, once in a while you run into this, the long stretch of detectable warnings. If you do that, be sure to provide a 36-inch aisle on the far side of it so that the wheelchair user doesn't have to. So as you can imagine, if this were only, I don't know, 18 inches wide on the left side of the detectable warnings, as somebody in a wheelchair tries to go from their parking stall all the way down to the front door, their right hand wheel is going to be going bumpity, 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 bump all the way down. Not nice. So that's advice, not code requirement. And that takes me to the final slide. So I'll take questions as long as anybody wants to ask questions. Otherwise, for those of you that are going to drop off, I do want to say thank you to all of you. I know this has taken a big part of your day, and I did look through the list of all of you that have signed up.